This is my slacker father-in-law. My daughter-in-law introduced me to her wealthy family. Everyone burst out laughing, but when her father walked into the room and saw my face, he said, "Daughter, this is the new owner of our company." Her face went pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clifford, and at 68 years old, I thought I had learned all there was to know about heartbreak. I was wrong. 3 years ago, I buried my wife, Margaret, after 42 years of marriage. Cancer took her slowly, and with her went the light from our small house on Maple Street, the same house where we raised our son Daniel, where we celebrated birthdays and holidays, where every corner held memories of a life well lived. After the funeral, the silence became my only companion. Daniel was all I had left. My boy, now 35, had always been gentle-hearted, perhaps too much so. When he brought Leah home 2 years ago, I tried my best to welcome her into our family. She was beautiful, polished, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly budget. Everything about her screamed money and status, things that had never mattered much to Margaret and me. The wedding was small, held at the country club where Leah's family were members. I wore my best suit, the same one I had worn to Margaret's funeral, and tried to smile through the ceremony. But even then I noticed how Leah's family looked at me. The polite nods, the tight smiles, the way they quickly moved on when introduced. I was clearly not what they had expected for their daughter-in-law's family. "Dad, this is Leah's mother, Patricia," Daniel had said during the reception, his voice carrying that nervous tone I knew too well. Patricia extended a manicured hand with all the warmth of a business transaction. "How nice to finally meet you, mister." She paused, clearly having forgotten my name despite being introduced twice already. "Clifford," I said simply, shaking her hand. "Thank you for welcoming my son into your family." Her smile was practiced, empty. "Of course. Leah tells us you're retired." The way she said retired made it sound like a disease. I nodded. "Yes, I sold my business a few years back. Nothing fancy, just a small operation." What I didn't tell her, what I had never told anyone, not even Daniel, was that my small operation had been worth considerably more than anyone imagined. After Margaret's death, I had quietly sold my manufacturing company to a larger corporation for $8.7 million. But the money felt meaningless without her to share it with. I put most of it away, keeping only what I needed to live simply in the house we had shared. I chose to live modestly because wealth without Margaret felt like a betrayal of the life we had built together. We had been happy with little, and I saw no reason to change that now. Daniel assumed I was getting by on Social Security and a small pension, and I never corrected him. Money had never been important in our family. But to Leah, everything was about appearances. The first real indication of how she viewed me came 3 months after the wedding. I had stopped by their new apartment, a sleek downtown condo that screamed money, to drop off some of Margaret's jewelry that I thought Leah might like. Daniel was at work, but Leah was home, talking loudly on her phone in the kitchen. "I know, Mother. It's embarrassing." Her voice carried through the thin walls. "Daniel's father is exactly what you'd expect from that side of town. Lives in some tiny old house, drives a car that's older than I am. I try to keep them separated as much as possible." I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still on the box of jewelry. "He's harmless enough," she continued. "Just pathetic, really. Poor Daniel is mortified by him too, but he's too nice to say anything. Thank God we don't have to see him often." The words hit me like physical blows. I set the jewelry box quietly on the entry table and left without making a sound. That night I sat in Margaret's chair and cried for the first time since her funeral. Not because of what Leah had said about me, but because my son, my only child, was apparently ashamed of his own father. Over the following months, the pattern became clear. Leah would find excuses to keep me away from family gatherings. "Oh, Dad, it's going to be so boring. Just Leah's work friends." Or, "It's really just a small thing, probably not worth your time." Daniel would echo her words, never quite meeting my eyes when he delivered these non-invitations. I started to feel like a ghost in my own son's life. The Sunday dinners we used to share became monthly, then sporadic. Phone calls grew shorter, more perfunctory. When I asked about their lives, Daniel's answers became vague, distant. Leah had succeeded in creating exactly the separation she wanted. The worst part was watching my son change. Daniel had always been considerate, always thinking of others first, but now he seemed constantly on edge, as if he was perpetually worried about disappointing someone. When we did spend time together, he kept checking his phone, clearly anxious about messages from Leah. "Is everything all right, son?" I asked him one afternoon when he had stopped by to help me fix a leaky faucet. It was the most time we had spent together in weeks. "Yeah, Dad, everything's fine," he said, but his hands were shaking as he tried to tighten the pipe fitting. His phone buzzed and he immediately grabbed it, reading the message with obvious anxiety. "Daniel," I said gently, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Just like when you were little?" He looked at me then, and for a moment I saw my scared little boy again, the same expression he used to get when he thought he had done something wrong. "I know, Dad, it's just, things are complicated now. Marriage is complicated." "Your mother and I had 42 years together," I said. "It doesn't have to be complicated if you're with the right person." He flinched at that, and I immediately regretted saying it. "Leah's a good person, Dad. She has high standards. She wants us to fit in with her family, and sometimes that means—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I understood perfectly. Sometimes that meant keeping the embarrassing father-in-law at arm's length. That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen eating a sandwich for dinner, I made a decision. I would not force myself into their lives. If Daniel was happier keeping me at a distance, then I would respect that choice. I would love him from afar and try not to let my broken heart show. But as I learned over the next few weeks, Leah wasn't content with simply excluding me. She had much bigger plans for her father-in-law. Plans that would soon reveal just how little she actually knew about the man she had written off as pathetic. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to Margaret's rose garden. I had kept it exactly as she left it, even though the thorns now seemed to catch my aging hands more often than they used to. "Dad?" Daniel's voice sounded strained through the phone. "Do you have a minute to talk?" I set down my pruning shears and walked to the porch steps, settling onto the wood that Margaret and I had painted together just 5 years ago. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Leah's family is having a dinner party this Friday. Her parents are celebrating their anniversary, and they're having some important people over. Business associates, family friends, that sort of thing." I waited, already sensing where this conversation was heading. "The thing is, Dad," another pause, longer this time, "it's going to be pretty formal. Black tie, fancy catered affair. Leah thinks it might be. Well, she's worried it might not be your kind of thing." The careful way he phrased it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't Daniel talking. These were Leah's words coming out of my son's mouth. "I see," I said quietly. "And what do you think, Daniel?" He started, then stopped. I could hear Leah's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. "I think maybe she's right, Dad. You know how these fancy parties can be. Lots of business talk, people showing off. You'd probably be bored." The excuse was so thin it was almost insulting. Margaret and I had attended plenty of business functions over the years when I was building my company. I knew how to wear a tuxedo and make small talk with bankers and investors. But Daniel didn't know that part of my life. He had been young when the business was growing, and I had deliberately kept that world separate from family time. "Well," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, "I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Thanks for understanding, Dad." I knew you would. The relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Maybe we can have lunch next week, just the two of us." After we hung up, I sat on those porch steps for a long time, watching the roses Margaret had planted bloom in the afternoon sun. A lunch, just the two of us, as if spending time with his father was something that needed to be compartmentalized, kept separate from his real life. But I had promised myself I wouldn't interfere, wouldn't make Daniel choose between his wife and his father. So I did what I always did these days. I swallowed my hurt and tried to understand. That evening, I called my old friend Robert, who had helped me navigate the sale of my business 3 years ago. We had stayed in touch, meeting for coffee occasionally to discuss everything from politics to our late wives' garden club adventures. "Cliff," he said warmly when he answered. "Good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Robert. Actually, I was wondering if you might want to grab dinner Friday night. Maybe that Italian place downtown." "Friday?" There was a pause. "Actually, that's interesting. I'm going to be at the Whitmore anniversary party that night. You know, Patricia and Charles Whitmore. He's been a client of mine for years. Big shindig at their estate. You'd probably know Charles if you met him. He's in manufacturing like you were. My blood went cold. Charles Whitmore? That's right. Do you know him? I did know the name. Charles Whitmore had tried to buy my company twice in the past decade, both times offering considerably less than what I eventually sold it for. He was the type of businessman who believed in lowball offers and intimidation tactics, the kind of man who wore his wealth like a weapon. We've crossed paths, I said carefully. Robert, who did you say was hosting this party? Charles and his wife Patricia. It's their 30th anniversary. They're having it at their estate up in Riverside Hills. The whole family will be there. Their daughter Leah just got married, and they're excited to show off the new son-in-law. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. Leah hadn't just excluded me from a random dinner party. She had specifically banned me from meeting her family's business associates, the very people who would know exactly who I was and what my company had been worth. Robert, I said slowly, what do you know about Charles Whitmore's financial situation these days? Funny you should ask. He's been having some troubles lately. Made some bad investments in tech stocks, and there are rumors about cash flow problems. Why do you ask? I stared out at Margaret's roses, my mind racing. Just curious. You know how it is with old competitors. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about what I had learned. Leah had deliberately kept me away from her parents' anniversary party because she was afraid I would somehow embarrass her family in front of their business associates. She had no idea that some of those same associates might very well know me by reputation. But more than that, she had manipulated my son into lying to me. She had made Daniel choose between us, and he had chosen her. That hurt more than all the rest combined. I spent Thursday wrestling with what to do. Part of me wanted to simply let it go, to continue living quietly and avoid any confrontation. But another part of me, the part that remembered building a business from nothing, the part that had negotiated million-dollar deals, was tired of being treated like I was invisible. Friday afternoon, I made my decision. I drove to the best men's store in town and bought a new tuxedo. Not rented, bought. I had it tailored that same day, paying extra for the rush job. Then I went to the florist and ordered an elegant anniversary bouquet for Patricia Whitmore. At 6 o'clock Friday evening, I dressed carefully in my new tuxedo, adjusted my tie in the mirror where Margaret used to help me with these things, and drove toward Riverside Hills. I had no intention of making a scene or causing drama. I simply wanted to see for myself what was so important that my own son had been convinced to exclude me from it. I wanted to understand what kind of people Leah valued more than family. The Whitmore estate was exactly what I expected, a sprawling colonial mansion with a circular driveway filled with luxury cars. Valets in white jackets directed traffic while guests in formal wear made their way toward the house. Through the large windows, I could see the glow of chandeliers and the movement of a crowd. I parked across the street and watched for a while, trying to spot Daniel and Leah among the guests visible through the windows. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how carefully Leah had orchestrated this evening. She had made sure that her husband's embarrassing father would be nowhere near her family's important celebration. But as I sat there in my car, watching other people's lives unfold through lit windows, something Margaret used to say came back to me. Clifford, you can't hide who you are forever. Truth has a way of finding the light. I was about to discover just how right she had been. As I reached for my keys to start the car and drive home, my phone rang. The caller ID made my heart skip. It was my former business attorney with news that would change everything about this evening. Clifford, the voice of my former attorney, Harold Stevens, cut through the evening air. I hope I'm not calling too late. I glanced at my watch, 7:15. Not at all, Harold. What can I do for you? Well, I have some rather urgent news about Meridian Industries, the company that purchased your business 3 years ago. Are you somewhere you can talk privately? I looked at the brightly lit Whitmore mansion across the street, where my son was celebrating with people who considered me unworthy of their presence. I'm very private right now. What's going on? Meridian filed for bankruptcy this morning, Chapter 11. They've been hemorrhaging money for the past 18 months, and their creditors finally pulled the plug. My chest tightened. What does that mean for the employees? There were over 200 people working there when I sold. That's actually why I'm calling. As part of the original sale agreement, you retained right of first refusal if the company ever went up for sale again. The bankruptcy court is moving fast. They want to liquidate assets quickly. You have 72 hours to decide if you want to exercise that right. I sat in stunned silence, watching well-dressed guests stream into the Whitmore estate. Harold, What kind of price are we talking about? Well, that's the interesting part. Because of the bankruptcy, you could potentially buy back your entire operation for about $2.3 million. Less than a third of what you sold it for. The equipment alone is worth more than that. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I sat outside this mansion, excluded from a party because I was supposedly too poor and unsuccessful to associate with these people, I was being offered the chance to buy back a company worth millions. There's something else, Harold continued. I did some research on the potential buyers. Most of the serious bidders are looking to strip the assets and sell off the equipment. If you don't step in, those 200 jobs will disappear permanently. I thought about the workers I had known for years. Maria in accounting, who had put 3 kids through college, Tom in manufacturing, who had worked his way up from the factory floor, Sarah in HR, who had started as my secretary when she was 19. They were more than employees. They were people whose lives had become intertwined with the business I had built. Harold, I need you to look into something for me. What do you know about Whitmore Manufacturing? Charles Whitmore's company? I know they've been struggling. Word is they're looking for a buyer or a major investor. Why do you ask? Just curious about the local business climate. If I were to buy back my company, I'd want to know who my competitors were. Well, between you and me, Whitmore isn't much competition anymore. They've lost several major contracts in the past year. Charles has been making some desperate moves, trying to find investors. I heard he even approached some of his daughter's social connections, trying to leverage family relationships for business deals. The pieces were falling into place. Charles Whitmore was apparently so desperate for business connections that he was using his daughter's marriage as a networking opportunity. And Leah was so focused on protecting her family's social image that she couldn't risk having Daniel's poor father around to embarrass them in front of potential investors. Harold, I want you to file the paperwork. I'm buying back my company. Are you sure, Clifford? It's a big decision to make so quickly. I looked across the street at the mansion where my son was probably making small talk with people who valued money more than family. I'm sure. How quickly can we move on this? I can have the initial paperwork filed first thing Monday morning. But Clifford, there's one more thing you should know. The bankruptcy court will need to verify your financing immediately. They'll require proof that you have the liquidity to complete the purchase. That won't be a problem. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, watching the party through the windows. I could see figures moving around inside, men in tuxedos, women in elegant gowns, servers carrying trays of champagne. Somewhere in that crowd was my son, probably being introduced to people as Leah's husband, while his father was carefully omitted from any conversation. I thought about Margaret and what she would say about this situation. She had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that how people treated you when they thought you had nothing revealed their true character. She also believed in standing up for yourself when it mattered. At 7:45, I made a decision that would have shocked the people inside that mansion. I got out of my car, straightened my new tuxedo, and walked across the street toward the Whitmore estate. I wasn't going to crash the party or make a scene. I was simply going to observe. I wanted to see with my own eyes how my son was being treated, and how Leah was representing our family to her own. I needed to understand what was so important that it was worth breaking a father's heart. The front entrance was bustling with activity. Valets took keys from arriving guests, while a doorman checked names against a list. I walked around to the side of the house where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the main reception area. The room was exactly what I expected. Crystal chandeliers, elegant furnishings, and groups of wealthy people holding expensive glasses of wine. I spotted Daniel almost immediately. He was standing near a large fireplace, wearing a tuxedo I had never seen before, talking to an older man in an expensive suit. Even from outside, I could see the tension in my son's shoulders, the way he kept glancing around the room as if looking for escape routes. Then I saw Leah. She was in her element, moving from group to group like a social butterfly, her red silk gown catching the light as she gestured animatedly. She had positioned herself at the center of attention, clearly enjoying being the recently married daughter at her parents' anniversary celebration. I moved closer to the window, staying in the shadows of the landscaping. The conversation inside was muted by the glass, but I could read body language and facial expressions. Leah was introducing Daniel to people with obvious pride, but I noticed something else. She kept her hand possessively on his arm, steering him away from certain conversations and toward others. Then I heard it. A group of people had moved closer to the window where I was hiding, and their voices carried clearly through the glass. Leah was speaking to an elderly woman wearing more diamonds than most people see in a lifetime. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, I'm so glad you could make it tonight. You simply must meet my husband, Daniel." She pulled Daniel forward with that same possessive grip I had noticed before. Daniel is absolutely brilliant. He works in software development, very modern, very cutting edge. "How wonderful," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that dripped with old money. "And what about his family? Are they in business as well?" I held my breath, wondering how Leah would answer. "Well," Leah said with a laugh that sounded practiced, "Daniel's mother passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. As for his father," she paused dramatically. "Let's just say Daniel has really risen above his circumstances. His father is more of a simple man, lives very modestly, if you know what I mean." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "Oh, one of those situations. How fortunate that Daniel inherited his ambition from his mother's side." "Exactly," Leah agreed. "We actually don't see much of his father anymore. He's rather set in his ways, not really equipped for situations like this." She gestured around the elegant room. "But Daniel has adapted beautifully to our lifestyle." I watched my son's face during this exchange. He looked physically ill, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. But he said nothing. He didn't defend me, didn't correct Leah's implications, didn't speak up for the man who had raised him and loved him unconditionally. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. I understood now exactly what Leah thought of me and how she was presenting our family to her social circle. I was the embarrassing secret, the shameful background that she was helping Daniel escape from. As I stood there in the darkness outside that glittering window, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. A cold, clear anger that reminded me of the businessman I used to be. Leah thought she knew who I was. She thought she had me figured out completely. She had no idea that she was about to learn just how wrong she could be. I drove home from the Whitmore estate in a daze, my mind reeling from what I had witnessed. The image of Daniel standing silent while his wife dismissed me as a simple man played over and over in my head. But beneath the hurt, something else was building, a determination I hadn't felt since Margaret's death. That weekend, I threw myself into research. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made my next move. Harold had given me the basic facts about Meridian Industries' bankruptcy, but I needed to know more about the broader business landscape, particularly Charles Whitmore's situation. What I discovered was fascinating. Whitmore Manufacturing wasn't just struggling, they were in free fall. Charles had made a series of catastrophic investments in tech startups that had collapsed during the market downturn. He had also expanded too aggressively, taking on debt to build new facilities that now sat half-empty. According to public filings, the company owed over $12 million to various creditors and was behind on payments to almost all of them. More interesting was what I learned about their client base. Whitmore Manufacturing specialized in automotive parts, exactly the kind of components my old company had produced. In fact, looking at their client list, I realized that Charles had been systematically underbidding my company for years, trying to steal contracts by offering unsustainably low prices. It explained why he had tried to buy me out twice. He hadn't wanted my business. He had wanted to eliminate his competition so he could raise his prices back to profitable levels. When I sold to Meridian instead, his plan had fallen apart. Now Meridian was bankrupt, and Charles was desperate for the contracts that were about to become available again. The only problem was that he didn't have the capital to bid aggressively, and his reputation for late deliveries and quality problems had made several major automotive companies hesitant to work with him. Sunday evening, Harold called with an update. "I've got good news and interesting news," he said. "The good news is that the bankruptcy court approved your financing verification. You're officially in the running to buy back Meridian. The interesting news is that there's only one other serious bidder. Let me guess. Charles Whitmore? How did you know? Lucky guess. What's his situation? Well, that's where it gets complicated. Whitmore doesn't actually have the cash to make a competitive bid, but he's put together an investor group. The lead investor is someone called Patricia Whitmore. I assume that's his wife." I almost laughed. Charles was so desperate that he was using his wife's money to try to buy my old company. Money that, based on what I had observed at their anniversary party, they were spending lavishly on maintaining their social status. Harold, what happens if neither of us gets the company? Then it goes to the asset strippers. They'll sell off the equipment, close the facilities, and those 200 jobs disappear permanently. That night, I sat in Margaret's chair and thought about the strange turn my life had taken. 3 days ago, I had been a lonely widower living quietly in his deceased wife's shadow. Now I was on the verge of re-entering the business world in a confrontation with the very people who had tried to erase me from their family's story. I thought about what Margaret would say. She had always been my moral compass, the one who helped me distinguish between revenge and justice. "Clifford," I could almost hear her saying, "ask yourself what you really want to accomplish. Do you want to hurt them or do you want to protect the people who matter?" The answer was clear. I wanted to save those jobs, and I wanted my son to see who his father really was. Everything else was secondary. Monday morning, I called Harold and told him to proceed with the purchase. By Tuesday afternoon, I was the official owner of my former company once again. The irony was almost poetic. I had bought back my life's work for less than half of what Charles Whitmore owed his creditors. But the real surprise came Wednesday morning, when Harold called with news that changed everything. "Clifford, you're not going to believe this. Charles Whitmore just called my office. He wants to meet with you." "About what?" "He didn't say specifically, but he seemed to think you might be interested in some kind of partnership arrangement. Apparently, he's heard that you're back in business and he wants to discuss mutually beneficial opportunities." I had to admire the man's audacity. He had spent years trying to destroy my company. His daughter had spent months treating me like an embarrassment, and now he wanted to be business partners. "Set up the meeting," I said. "Friday afternoon, my office." "Are you sure about this, Clifford, given the family situation?" "I'm very sure. But Harold, I want you to do some additional research before Friday. I want to know exactly how bad Charles's financial situation really is. Assets, debts, cash flow, everything. I'll get right on it." Thursday evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Daniel stood on my front porch, looking nervous and uncomfortable in a way that reminded me of when he was 12 years old and had to confess to breaking his mother's favorite vase. "Dad, can we talk?" I opened the door wider. "Of course, come in." He followed me to the living room but remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I heard about your business deal, about you buying back your old company." "How did you hear about that?" "Leah's father mentioned it. He seemed surprised." I waited for him to continue. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He took a deep breath. "How much money do you actually have?" The question hung in the air between us. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the dawning realization that perhaps everything he thought he knew about his father might be wrong. "Enough," I said simply. "But I thought, we always lived so simply. After Mom died, you seemed to be scraping by. I offered to help with expenses, and you always said you were fine. But you assumed I was poor." He winced. "Not poor exactly, just getting by, living on Social Security and whatever small pension you had from the business." I walked to the window and looked out at Margaret's rose garden. "Daniel, your mother and I lived simply because that's what made us happy. We had enough money to live differently, but we chose not to. After she died, I saw no reason to change that. But the business sale, you said it was just a small operation. It was small compared to General Motors." "It was worth $8.7 million when I sold it." The color drained from Daniel's face. He sank into Margaret's chair without asking, staring at me as if he had never seen me before. $8.7 million? Plus investments and other assets. "Daniel, I've never been poor. I've been grieving, and I've been lonely, but I've never been the financial burden that your wife thinks I am." He put his head in his hands. "Oh God, Dad, the things she said, the things I've let her say. I know what she said. I heard some of it Friday night." His head snapped up. "Friday night, but you weren't." "I was there, Daniel. Outside, looking through the windows, listening to your wife explain to her mother's friends how you had risen above your circumstances, how your father was too simple to be included in polite society." The shame on his face was painful to watch. "Dad, I wanted to say something. I wanted to defend you, but it was easier to let her handle the embarrassing family situation." He started to cry then, and I saw my little boy again, the one who used to run to me when he was scared, who trusted me to fix everything that went wrong in his world. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't know how I let this happen." I sat down across from him, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. "Daniel, your father-in-law has asked to meet with me Friday afternoon. He wants to discuss a business partnership. Daniel looked up sharply. He what? Apparently, word has gotten out that I'm back in business. He seems to think we might have mutually beneficial opportunities to explore. Dad, you should know. Leah's family is in trouble. Real financial trouble. Her father has been asking everyone for loans, investors, anything. Leah is terrified that they're going to lose the house. And she's hoping that her new son-in-law's family might be able to help. Daniel's silence was answer enough. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the meeting that was now just 24 hours away. Charles Whitmore was about to discover that the simple man he had dismissed wasn't quite what he seemed. And Leah was about to learn that the father-in-law she had tried to hide might be the only thing standing between her family and financial ruin. The game was about to change completely. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that Margaret had always loved. I stood in my closet, choosing between the conservative navy suit I usually wore to business meetings and the charcoal gray one I had bought for special occasions. Today felt like a special occasion, though not in any way I could have imagined a week ago. Charles Whitmore arrived at my office precisely at 2 o'clock, accompanied by a younger man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as his financial advisor. I watched through my window as they climbed out of a black Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Charles moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around my modest office building as if he were calculating its worth. "Clifford," he said when my secretary showed them in, extending his hand with the practiced warmth of a seasoned businessman. "Thank you for making time to see me. I have to admit I was surprised to hear you were back in the game." "Charles," I replied, shaking his hand and gesturing toward the conference table. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you coffee?" "That would be great." As we settled around the table, I studied the man who had tried twice to buy my company at below-market prices, whose daughter had spent months treating me like an embarrassing family secret. He was younger than me by perhaps 10 years, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from golf courses and vacation homes. Everything about him projected success and confidence. Everything except his eyes. Those were the eyes of a desperate man. "Clifford, I'll get straight to the point," Charles began, pulling out a leather portfolio. "I understand you've recently reacquired Meridian Industries. Congratulations on that, by the way. It takes vision to see opportunity in a bankruptcy situation." "Thank you. The thing is, I think we could help each other out. Whitmore Manufacturing has been cultivating relationships with several major automotive companies, and I know they're looking for reliable suppliers for some significant upcoming contracts." I nodded politely, though I knew from my research that Charles had actually lost several major contracts in recent months due to quality issues and late deliveries. "What I'm proposing," he continued, "is a strategic partnership. We combine our client relationships with your manufacturing capabilities, 50-50 split on all new business." His financial advisor slid a folder across the table. "We've prepared some preliminary projections that show the potential for significant mutual benefit." I opened the folder and scanned the documents. The numbers were impressively optimistic and completely unrealistic. They projected revenues that would require my factory to operate at 150% capacity, while somehow maintaining perfect quality control. "These are interesting projections," I said carefully. "What exactly would Whitmore Manufacturing be contributing to this partnership?" Charles shifted in his chair. "Well, as I mentioned, we have established relationships with key players in the automotive industry, contacts that have taken years to develop. That kind of access is invaluable in this business." "I see. And in terms of capital investment?" The question hung in the air. Charles exchanged a glance with his advisor before clearing his throat. "Well, naturally, the partnership would be structured to leverage each party's strengths. Your manufacturing capacity, our market relationships." It was a polite way of saying that he wanted to use my factory and my money to chase contracts he could no longer win on his own. "Charles, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "How much do you know about my family situation?" The question clearly caught him off guard. "Your family situation?" "My son Daniel is married to your daughter Leah." His confident facade flickered for just a moment. "Yes, of course. Lovely young couple. Leah speaks very highly of Daniel." "And what has she told you about me?" Another uncomfortable pause. Well, you know how young people are. They don't always. That is, Leah mentioned that you've been through a difficult period since your wife's passing. She seems to think you've been somewhat retired from business. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. Somewhat retired. That's an interesting way to put it. Clifford, I hope you don't think there's any connection between this business proposal and our family relationship. This is purely about business opportunities. Of course, I said. Just like I'm sure it's purely coincidental that you're approaching me now, just weeks after discovering that your daughter's father-in-law isn't quite the simple retiree she thought he was. Charles's practiced smile faltered completely. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Charles. I'm stating it directly. You're in financial trouble. Serious trouble. You owe approximately $12 million to various creditors. You've lost 3 major contracts in the past 6 months, and your company's credit rating has been downgraded twice this year. The color drained from his face. How do you know all this? It's public information if you know where to look. The question is, what does your daughter know about your situation? His advisor started to say something, but Charles held up a hand to stop him. For the first time since he had walked into my office, he looked like the desperate man I knew him to be. Leah doesn't know how bad things are, he said quietly. Patricia and I have been trying to protect her from the stress. She's just starting her marriage, building her new life. Building her new life by being ashamed of her husband's family. Charles winced. Leah can be particular about social situations. She grew up with certain expectations about how things should be, expectations that don't include having a working-class father-in-law around to embarrass her. Clifford, I think there may have been some misunderstandings. Charles, I interrupted. Let me tell you about misunderstandings. Last Friday night, I stood outside your house and listened to your daughter tell your guests that my son had risen above his circumstances and that his father was too simple to be included in polite society. Is that the kind of misunderstanding you're referring to? The silence in the room was deafening. Charles stared at the table, his face pale. His advisor looked like he wanted to disappear. You were there? Charles asked finally. I was there. I heard every word. I watched my son stand silent while his wife dismissed his father as an embarrassment. Clifford, I had no idea. Of course you had no idea, because you never bothered to find out who I actually was. You just accepted your daughter's assessment that I was some poor old man who wasn't worth your time. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Charles' expensive Mercedes sat next to my modest sedan. Here's what's going to happen, Charles. I'm going to rebuild my company. I'm going to hire back every worker who wants to return, and I'm going to compete for every contract that becomes available when companies realize that Whitmore Manufacturing can't deliver on its promises. I turned back to face him, and I'm going to do it without any help from you or your family. Charles looked panicked. Clifford, please. I know there have been some social awkwardnesses, but we can work past that. We're family now. Family? I let the word hang in the air. Is that what you call it when your daughter spends months convincing my son to be ashamed of his own father? Is that what you call it when I'm deliberately excluded from family gatherings because I might embarrass you in front of your business associates? If we could just start over. Charles, you have exactly 72 hours to make a decision. You can continue trying to salvage your failing business on your own, or you can swallow your pride and ask for help from the simple old man your daughter has been hiding from you. His advisor leaned forward. What kind of help? I smiled for the first time since they had arrived. The kind that comes with conditions. Very specific conditions about how family members treat each other. Charles looked confused. I don't understand. You will, after you talk to your daughter about tonight's dinner plans. What dinner plans? I picked up my phone and pressed a button. My secretary's voice came through the intercom. Yes, Mr. Clifford? Please call Daniel and ask him to invite Leah and her parents for dinner at their apartment tonight. 7 o'clock. Tell him it's important family business. Charles's eyes widened. Clifford, what are you planning? I looked at him steadily. I'm planning to give your daughter the opportunity to meet her father-in-law properly. The real one, not the version she's been hiding from you. As Charles and his advisor gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I could see the fear in his eyes. He was finally beginning to understand that the game had changed completely. Charles, I said as they reached the door, one more thing. When you go home and tell Patricia and Leah about our conversation, You might want to mention that I'll be bringing a copy of the purchase agreement for Meridian Industries. I think they'll find the financial details quite interesting." After they left, I sat alone in my office and thought about Margaret. She had always believed that people revealed their true character when they thought no one important was watching. Tonight, we would see what kind of people my son had married into when they could no longer pretend I didn't matter. Tonight, Leah would finally meet the real Clifford. And I suspected it would be the most educational dinner of her life. I arrived at Daniel and Leah's apartment at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. It wasn't a gesture of extravagance, it was a statement. Tonight, there would be no more pretending about who I was or what I was capable of. Daniel answered the door, his face a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. He had clearly been thinking about our conversation all week, trying to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the man who had just bought a multi-million-dollar company. "Dad," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "They're already here." I could hear voices from the living room, Charles speaking in low, urgent tones, presumably filling in his wife and daughter on the afternoon's revelations. As I handed Daniel the wine, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Daniel," I said quietly, "whatever happens tonight, remember that I love you. Nothing will ever change that." He looked at me with eyes that reminded me so much of Margaret's. "Dad, I'm scared I've ruined everything." "You haven't ruined anything that can't be fixed, but some things are going to have to change." We walked into the living room together. Charles and Patricia sat on the sofa, their faces tense and watchful. Leah stood by the window, her arms crossed, looking like a woman preparing for battle. She had changed from whatever she had worn during the day into a cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Another statement about status and superiority. "Clifford," Patricia said, rising with the kind of forced politeness that wealthy people use when they're caught off guard. "How lovely to see you again." "Patricia," I nodded politely. "Thank you for accepting Daniel's invitation." Leah turned from the window, her expression carefully neutral. "Hello, Clifford. I understand congratulations are in order. Daniel tells me you've made some kind of business investment." The way she said business investment made it sound like I had bought a hot dog cart. I could see that despite whatever Charles had told her about our meeting, she still didn't grasp the reality of the situation. "Thank you, Leah. Yes, I've reacquired my former company. It's good to be back in business." Daniel appeared with glasses and began opening the wine I had brought. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he were performing surgery rather than serving drinks. "Charles mentioned that you wanted to discuss some kind of family business," Patricia said, settling back onto the sofa. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure what business we might have to discuss." I looked around the room, at Charles, who couldn't quite meet my eyes, at Patricia, who was still trying to maintain her social superiority, at Leah, who stood with the defensive posture of someone who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source, and at Daniel, who looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Well," I said, accepting a glass of wine from my son, "I thought it might be time for us to get to know each other properly. It seems there have been some misconceptions about who I am and what my role in this family should be." Leah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Misconceptions?" "Yes. For instance, the misconception that I'm too simple or too poor to be included in family gatherings. Or the misconception that my son should be ashamed of his background and work to distance himself from his father." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia glanced nervously at Charles, who was studying his wine glass with unusual intensity. "Clifford," Leah said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I think you may have misunderstood some casual comments. You know how people talk at parties." "Actually, I know exactly how people talk at parties. I was there last Friday night. If I had thrown a bomb into the center of the room, it couldn't have created more shock." Leah went pale. Patricia gasped audibly, and Charles finally looked up from his wine glass. "You were where?" Leah demanded. "Outside your parents' house, listening to you explain to Mrs. Henderson how Daniel had risen above his circumstances and how his father was too simple to be included in polite society." Leah's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "You were spying on us?" "I was trying to understand why my own son had been convinced to exclude me from a family celebration. What I discovered was quite educational." Daniel set down his wine glass with shaking hands. "Leah, you told me it was just going to be boring business talk. You said Dad wouldn't enjoy it." "It was business talk," Leah said defensively. Important people were there. People who matter in this city. People who matter, I repeated slowly, as opposed to people like me who don't matter. That's not what I meant. Leah, I interrupted. Let me tell you what I learned about people who matter. I learned that your father's company owes $12 million to creditors. I learned that you've lost 3 major contracts and your credit rating has been downgraded twice. I learned that your family is facing financial ruin, despite all your efforts to maintain appearances. The silence that followed was absolute. Leah stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. How do you know that? Patricia whispered. Because Charles came to my office this afternoon asking for a business partnership. He wanted access to my factory, my client base, and my capital to save his failing company. Leah spun toward her father. Dad, is that true? Charles cleared his throat uncomfortably. Leah, sweetheart, business has been challenging lately. How challenging? Her voice was rising now, panic creeping in. We've had some setbacks, Charles, I said quietly. Tell her the truth. Tell her how challenging. He looked at his daughter's face and seemed to crumble. We might lose the house. The business is. We're in serious trouble, Leah. She sank into a chair as if her legs had given out. But the anniversary party, all those people, the catering, we put it on credit cards, Patricia admitted. We thought if we could maintain appearances long enough, something would work out. Leah's face cycled through several emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a dawning horror as she began to understand the implications. So, when you came to my office today, I continued, addressing Charles, you weren't just looking for a business partner. You were looking for someone to save your family from bankruptcy, someone with the resources to bail you out of the hole you've dug. Clifford, please. The irony, I said, taking a sip of wine, is that you are asking for help from the same man your daughter has spent months treating like an embarrassment. The man she specifically excluded from your anniversary party because he might damage your reputation with potential investors. Leah looked up sharply. You don't understand the pressures. I understand perfectly. I understand that you value appearances more than family. I understand that you convinced my son to be ashamed of his own father. And I understand that now that you need something from me, suddenly I'm worth having a conversation with. Daniel had been silent through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up. Dad, what are you saying? I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the confusion in his eyes, the guilt, but also something else, relief, as if he had been carrying a burden he didn't know how to put down. I'm saying that respect isn't something you turn on and off based on what you need from someone. I'm saying that family means standing by each other, not hiding each other when it's convenient. What do you want from us? Leah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I want an apology, a real one. I want acknowledgement of how you've treated me and how you've manipulated my son into participating in that treatment. And if we do that, then we start over, as a real family this time. Leah stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating. She was weighing her pride against her family's financial desperation, trying to determine what she could afford to lose. I'm sorry, she said finally, though the words came out stiff and rehearsed. That's a start, I said. But Leah, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about saying the right words. This is about changing how you think about family, about what really matters. I understand. Do you? Because your father's company is going to fail regardless of whether I help him or not. His debts are too large and his reputation is too damaged. But I can offer him something else, a job. A position managing one of my production facilities. Good salary, good benefits, a chance to rebuild his career. Charles looked up sharply. You'd do that? I do that for family, real family, the kind that includes everyone, not just the people who look good at parties. Patricia started crying then, not the elegant tears of a society woman, but the raw, desperate sobs of someone whose world was falling apart. But, I continued, it comes with conditions. No more excluding me from family events. No more treating me like an embarrassment. And most importantly, no more manipulating my son into choosing between his wife and his father. Leah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, whatever you want. I looked at Daniel, who was staring at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. What I want, I said, is a family that treats each other with respect and love. What I want is Sunday dinners where everyone is welcome. What I want is grandchildren who know their grandfather and aren't ashamed of where they come from. I stood up and set my wine glass on the coffee table. I'm going home now. You all have some things to discuss. Daniel, call me tomorrow when you've decided what kind of family you want to have. As I walked to the door, I heard Leah's voice behind me, small and broken. Clifford? I turned back. I really am sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Leah, I said gently, you didn't understand because you never bothered to find out. The measure of a person isn't their bank account or their social status. It's how they treat the people who can't do anything for them. I looked around the room one last time. Margaret used to say that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. We choose to love each other, to support each other, to stand by each other even when it's inconvenient or embarrassing. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman, Patricia said through her tears. She was, and she would have loved all of you if you had given her the chance. 3 months later, I was standing in my backyard watching Daniel and Leah help me plant new roses in Margaret's garden. Charles was inside the house playing chess with Harold Stevens, who had become a regular guest at our Sunday dinners. Patricia was in the kitchen learning to make Margaret's famous pot roast with the help of my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. It wasn't the family I had imagined when Daniel first brought Leah home. But it was a real family, imperfect, complicated, but built on truth instead of appearances. Leah had changed more than anyone. The crisis had stripped away her pretensions and revealed someone capable of genuine warmth and humility. She had thrown herself into learning about my business, about Margaret's life, about the family she had almost destroyed through her own blindness. Clifford, she said now, looking up from the rosebush she was carefully positioning. Do you think Margaret would have approved of these new varieties? I smiled, thinking of my wife's spirit somehow blessing this second chance we had all been given. I think, I said, she would have loved watching her family grow. And for the first time since Margaret's death, I truly meant it when I called them family.